And can we admit the person online, or is it from you guys, or okay? So someone is trying to join in. If you can admit, if everyone can take their seats, and to those online, apologies. We're trying to gather everyone here. So 2 minutes. Hi, everyone. I know it's the afternoon and it's a little bit tricky, but what we have, the exercise that we have, and also online, the exercise that we have is a very fast paced that needs your thinking hats for this. So please be as attentive and as engaged as possible. The the exercise we'll be doing is called reverse methodology. As you know, it's easier to critique things, to pull out the negatives, and to see challenges than solutions. So our first attempt would be, what if we go negative? What if we are the destructors? And what if we start identifying those things that don't work? And then off of that, we try to look out for solutions. So a lot of it is about fast thinking and um, about problem solving exercise, which I'm sure everybody is amazing at. We will try to have as inclusive of a process as possible. So all of our online participants will be using Miro here that you see online. Uh, it's possible for participants in person to make interventions. Both our virtual participants can also make interventions, but we very much appreciate it if you can write. There are post-its, right? If you can write your ideas on the post-its, and Julie here would be taking this post-its and she will be sharing it with Ben and Suman to then. Can I see Suman? Yes, and Ben there, they will be helping us synthesize this post notes as well. So, and the Mira board, those of you online, if you have any difficulties, please put it on the chat, and someone will be able to help you. So we will try to make it as synchronous as possible, but do let us know if there's any problems, like if the mics are not working. Please do limit interventions to be very brief. We don't have much time because we'll be running through them in a 10 minutes kind of circuit. So we'll start off with the private sector and move to the intergenerational and gender equity. So for virtual participants, please put your inputs there, and if you have any issues, do let us know. And if you want to make an intervention based on your sticky note there, do let us know, and we will be able to accommodate that. And then for in-persons, do write it, but also if you want to expand on your sticky note, please raise your hands. We've got mics in front of you, or we can have a mic around. So let's start off with the first question. So we will have 10 minutes for this. I want you to have your thinking hat on, and we are going to react. We're going to identify the problem. So the first one is, and this is going to be interesting, how can we weaken the collaboration? Listen to me. How can we weaken the collaboration between the private sector and the public sector away from tangible climate change adaptation action? So we are being destructive here. How do we weaken that? How do we make sure they don't work together? So please take 10 minutes to come up with answers to these questions. Um, and then, yes.
Um, I was just going to say that perhaps you could put the question on the screen because we're not able to capture the question. Or is it somewhere where I don't know where it is?
Yes, so the question is this. The question is straightforward. How do we weaken the collaboration between private sector and public sector? You can be as general, as specific, as generic, as detailed as you can.
I don't know how this clever smart board works. I have put some stickers there. But anyway, I think a very good way of weakening the collaboration is just you don't put any regulation. There is no need to look at the impacts of climate change, and therefore really that will never create any demand for adaptation solutions, so not all for the private sector. So don't ever consider regulating the need to do climate risk assessment, particularly in the context of infrastructure investment. So no really role.
Thank you very much, and apologies. I couldn't figure out if it was in person or online. But if you want to speak, do flag it to us and make sure you add it. But that was I think an interesting point with enthusiasm, and I like the energy of that thought. So please do, if you want to make an intervention, for those in person, do raise your hands. For those online, do flag it, and we will see. We will give you the floor. But yes, write them on the sticky note. When you're done, please hand them to Julie. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Hi, this is Shella. Are the in-person participants able to access this collaborative platform if we have our laptops with us, as many of us do? Okay.
Yeah. So ideally, just write with a pen. That is easier for the in-person participants. Rita, I see you have your hands up. You have the floor.
Yeah, I wanted to ask whether someone can share the link to the platform so that we can access it.
Okay. I think I think it's shared now. You should be able to access it.
Where is it shared? It's not in the chat.
It's in the chat. I can see it in the chat.
I joined some minutes later, so it might not be there any longer or not visible for me. If you could post that again, or for everybody who joined a minute later, that would be nice. Thank you.
Okay, we will send it to you now. But I can see we're having some good input here. Anyone wants to say anything? We've got 3 minutes on this. So Ben and Suman, as they get the posted from the in-person participants, they are uploading them in real time and they are categorizing them as well. So as you can see online, things are coming out of Any innovative ideas on how to not make this work?
I'll speak. So I think one innovative idea for it to not work would be not let the blending happening between public and private capital. Because how private capital, at least initially, comes in for climate mitigation or adaptation projects is public capital coming first, taking the initial risks, and then it acts as a de-risking element for private capital to come in. So if you would not allow that de-risking to happening through public capital, private capital might not come in for the desired returns.
Thank you very much.
It's on. Speak.
Oh, it is on. Okay. Well, I mean, the public sector has the role of creating the enabling environment. So if you take that away, that will weaken a lot of the potential private sector action. So, the enabling environment, including regulations, budget allocations, incentives, could be financial incentives, and provision of climate risk information, public good provision, basically. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Anyone online before we close? Okay, let me give the opportunity if there's anyone online, and I'll come to in person. We don't have, so you have the floor.
Show that the field of climate change adaptation is less profitable, and it's not priority for private institutions. Also, it is like a risky investment. This is how.
Thanks. So we've got 30 seconds if anyone online. No, but I can see a lot of inputs coming in. So let's move on to the second bit of the exercise. Oh, okay. Rita, you have the floor. Sorry.
Yeah, this format is a bit challenging, I have to say, reading and writing at the same time and digesting what others are saying. I think the question is, so what is it we would not like to have? So I posted one on the lack of regulation to de-risk investments in a very broad sense. So I think that is something we don't want to have.
Thanks. One more. Kulthum.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure how we are running this, but I guess I'll just take the floor because some are writing, some are taking the floor. So I'll just take the floor. There's one that I wrote. I don't know if it's there because I don't have a laptop. I talked about conflicting priorities and interests between the private sector and the public sector, because you tend to see that while private sector is involved in like key infrastructure, construction and infrastructure projects, you tend to see that it can drive action, but it may leave the poor out, which is an interest and a priority for public sector. So therefore, conflicting interest is, if that is there, and I think it should be there. I just wanted to elaborate because it may not be very clear. Thanks.
Thanks. I know it's a little bit of a challenge with new modalities, and I guess we're trying to make things work. In that sense, I think the next question. Moving on to the next question, how do we then reverse this? And meaning this is not just to say flip and create enabling environment as a solution, but what are the specific mindset change that we need in order to address some of the challenges or the problems that we have identified, because some of this are actual realities, right? These are things that governments lack, private sectors lack. I see lack of data as some of the issue, creating or have a limiting effect on blending climate finance, private and public sector finance as a challenge. So what is the broader mindset change that we need to bring in order to bring better public-private sector partnerships? So we have 10 minutes for this. And to address Kultum's question about modalities, we can write it, and the preference would be to write it, but we would like to hear if anyone wants to elaborate more, because I know it might not, some things might not just fit a post-it, so they might need an explanation. So that's the intervention is to that effect.
Just a quick question. Should we use the same colored post-its for the suggestions? Over?
Yes. So now the next exercise would be outside the purple color, the outside, which will be the gray area on the screen. So we'll now put the post-its for virtual participants. We will be putting the sticky notes in the gray area. So we have 10 minutes. So the question is, so we have identified some of the challenges. You have identified some challenge. What is the mindset shift that we need to bring towards addressing? So it's not just solving one of the issue, but about changing the mindset towards effectively addressing the problem itself.
Sorry, I can't find new clean post-it. Where do I get that?
So
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, they're coming. Thank you very much.
So we're just zooming in just so you see what's being posted to give you an idea. These are things that are coming from both the virtual and the post-its that we're submitting. So it's we're seeing a lot of inputs. To be honest, we're getting a lot of inputs considering what we were expecting, and we're very happy to see that. So the third phase of this private sector discussion bit would be the react and reflect session, where we talk about the challenge that we've raised, where the connecting bits are. Briefly looking at what's coming out, I see a lot of policy actions, some relationship on how public-private partnerships could be strengthened, some action-oriented, including how investments need to be channeled, and how risks can be addressed. So how do you connect the dots? How do we then see? Because some of the things we've been saying in the past, right? We've been talking about public-private partnership for a long time, but what is it that we are lacking, and what is it that needs connecting to get us to a changed mindset and transformed partnership that would enhance adaptation action? So I will open the floor for reflection, but you can also add your comments as we go along. But let's reflect on this. Nico.
Thank you, Vinny. We are still puzzled about this topic, since as we have seen, not only from the adaptation or climate sphere arena of investments, some of those have been lost. For instance, we recently see the Credit Suisse default, where the Switzerland government sent a lot of public funds to save that bank. So that is just a way where the private sector or as well financial institutions can lose their investments. So that fear of the private sector of losing the investment because of lack of climate data, lack of regulations, lack of will still there. And in either case, the public funding have to, in some cases, rescue the private or make an insurance or assurance for the private investment to allocate these resources on adaptation or mitigation actions. So we wonder if there are some expertise in the table as well as the people in join virtually, if there is any new mechanism or instruments that in public at the end having public resources supporting or assurance of for the private sector to invest in. It's having in mind that maybe it could be lost one part or the whole part or any percentage, because we are working on a new topic on different arenas, and the learning curve is just starting, as we have heard from the multilateral development banks and other banks. Thank you.
Thanks, Nico. That's a very important point about risks. This link is if you want to access for those with laptops. If you want to access the Miro board, you can use this and see what's happening. But I think that's a very important point that you've raised about de-risking, because what's in it for us is the question that private sector always asks in adaptation. So yeah, let's continue our conversation. I would like to give the opportunity for anyone virtually before I give for in person. Anyone? Okay, so I will go.
Okay, so I think just on the first question you asked about weakening and then strengthening and then looking at the connections, you can theme it in like three broad areas, and this is just my thinking around the lived realities of what's happening in the Pacific. One is around governance, institutional strengthening, like there needs to be some form of connection there. I guess you can't continue to argue it's profits before people, right? Like you like that's the motive that private sector uses. So I guess in terms of governance and institution, lacking is or where we really need to make the connection is what is the role of private sector in development planning processes. So where can we bring them? Because in the public sector space, so for example, for small island states, they go for a bidding process and having the procurement process through private sector. So helping them understand it on the onset of what is their value add in this process can be very beneficial. So involving them in that phase. Second, within the institutional strengthening, there's a lot of talk about regulation, but I feel like there is no shifts towards incentivizing, procurement of or investments on climate adaptation or climate mitigation. This is a long conversation that we've been having since 2014, or when Marrakesh partnership came up. We do not see it easy for public sector or governments to incentivize investments towards this. So some of the things that have recently been happening in the space with private sector per se is like tax waiver, GST waiver. That's like micro activities that's been happening, but something that's missing as well is with this institutional strengthening is the financing mechanism. We can all attest to that the way in which climate adaptation financing modalities are set between the private sector that is accessible to the private sector is something that kind of demoralizes the private sector to kind of engage in this space. And most of it is controlled where it is by public sector. It's channeled through the public sector. So helping them understand in terms of whether it's accountability issue or whatever it is, it's about engaging them so that they are able to understand that, right? And so in saying that, I guess with the financing facilities or however this is going to, and TBN said that there is no physical space mostly for countries to take on additional loans. So where can the private sector come in? But one thing we missed out in the first stage and the second stage, and which Nico touched upon very briefly as well, is the communication aspect of it. I mean, like the passing of data information is one thing, but the strengthening the communication between private and public sector for most countries is still far paced. I mean, developed countries, there is mechanisms in place where they communicate with each other on a regular basis. For developing small island states, like private sector would prefer that there's information hoarding, there's not sharing of enough information and so forth. So I think those are the connections that we can draw upon.
Thank you. I think that those are very important points. Anyone online?
If I may come in.
Okay.
Hi, this is Cinzia from EIB. I just wanted to maybe follow on from the last comment, which was really helpful. And I would say that what we see in our experience, the private sector doesn't really know where it fits in, just doesn't understand really where they fit in the world of adaptation. Whilst they now have a very clear role in the world of mitigation because they've been involved for many decades now. And of course, the case is easier because you can demonstrate that there is returns on investment, there are profits to be made. So it's always been much more appealing to engage in that area than it is to engage on adaptation. But even with the willing, which is a very small set of private sector actors, perhaps, it's really difficult for them to understand where they fit in. So if there is one lesson that we can learn from the mitigation world, it is really about the carrot and stick. We heard before from some of the colleagues in the group, that we need to provide incentives. So can we really define what these incentives are? The risking, so the right type of capital, the right type of partnership, of financing partnership is very, very important. Technology is an area where private sector has huge role to play. We need them. We desperately need them for the adaptation solutions. So that's one where we can really engage. And the other point that follows from that is that we always talk about engaging the private sector, but it's a very let's say, unfocused conversation. The engagement needs to be focused on areas where they do have an interest and they can play a role. If they can see that, if we can make the business case for their engagement, they will engage. That's definitely our experience. But to expect the private sector actors to finance maybe flood management infrastructure is unrealistic. It's not impossible, but it's much, much harder. So perhaps let's start from the low-hanging fruits, where they can really see a role to play. And the back of this, of course, is the role of the public sector, which is to provide the regulations, the right type of information, which is a huge barrier for private sector investment because there is uncertainty to do with future risks. What will happen, we don't know. But there are ways of addressing that by providing the right type of information. So lesson learned from the mitigation work is really the carrot and stick. We need to also offer a carrot. It has to be the right type of carrot. We need to make a business case for the role. But on the other hand, we really need the public sector to step up and come up with strong regulations, imposing addressing physical climate risk to all sorts of activities that will then create a demand for products, technologies and services that the private sector can provide.
Thank you very much. I would like to hear from maybe next participants. When we talk about private sector, we always talk about the money coming from the private sector, but also there is a huge private sector in many developing countries that actually need support as well, because it's small and medium scale enterprises that are actually suffering themselves from, say, for example, those who are engaged in fisheries that then need sufficient adaptation measures to continue and sustain their business. So also in that context, it would be great to hear you reflect on that. I think I've seen your hand first.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if I'm going to answer that question, but I think regarding the question, I think putting people at the center, I think it's what is always missing in this collaboration, and presents a good connector on why this public-private sector partnerships collaboration could work. And I agree with the component and the feedback in terms of institutional strengthening, but I think there needs to be a structured engagement and also aspects, principles around shared values, how sustainability can be ensured, and really the outlook in terms of having long-term partnerships, because we've seen a lot of piecemeal engagement. And of course, I think a biggest area as well is to really have a component on learning, because that can allow for drawing of experiences from other previous public-private sector engagement that have worked.
Yes. So you've asked about how to change the mindset between the private sector and the public sector. Well, I guess the key element here is they need to find a common interest and they need to establish a common goal. It means like both sectors needs to know how they can work together and what are the opportunities for them, like to work together and to gain profit, like from both sides. Also, I believe another important point is to like encourage open communication. It means public sector especially need to share like data and share all the necessary infos with the private sectors, and also the private sector needs to show what are the threats for the private sector. This is how we can change mindsets between both sectors. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. I would like to share an example from. Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. Sorry. Yeah. All right. Thank you. I would like to share some examples from the Maldives. Again, sharing the island Kudafari in Nuno Atoll of the Maldives. There are really good private sector, public sector examples that they have been taking upon in terms of transformative adaptation, I must say. One example is when they developed their land use plan. Instead of having all the roads designed for automobiles, they allocated roads for walkability and specifically using bicycles. And one way of where the public sector, like the local council, has incentivized or created that enabling environment for more bicycle use is to give 0% interest or interest-free loans for school children to buy bicycles. So this does not only address the mitigation element in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but it also encourages active lifestyles, which create or promotes the well-being of the local communities. So in terms of a more whole of society approach, this is a really good example. Another key example that I would like to give is that the whole island has targeted for zero waste, and this was something that was a vision of the school children. The school children wanted the island to be a zero waste island. So the council, again, together with how to say that they went ahead in terms of the typical consultation process, but they tried new ways to ensure meaningful engagement of young people as well as the older generation. And they managed to onboard the whole of community to segregate their waste into 19 different components, and they are on the pathway to achieving zero waste as well. With the where the private sector comes into play is there is a tourist resort, one of the luxury resorts that is supporting this island in terms of this island recently got a desalinated water system. So to support in that desalinated water system with the filtration system so that they can go for bottled water, which eliminates the single-use plastic water that is introduced to that island. So many examples like that this island is leading by example, and I would like to highlight that for small island developing states like the Maldives, micro businesses really need a lot of support and incentives to bring about that transformative change that is so urgently needed. Thank you.
Very much. Kulthum, then Sheila, like the last one.
Yes, thank you. Just wanted to add to the conversation, particularly the question that you asked. Yeah, I mean, what we really see is that there's very little evidence for private sector. Can you hear me? Okay, I must get closer like that. Yes, there's very little evidence for private sector engagement and private sector participation in adaptation. So we don't really see a lot of that, particularly in developing countries. And we need to ask ourselves, why is that the case? And I think some of the questions, some of the issues have been raised because it's not, mainly, I mean, I think this has been said a few times that we need to demonstrate dealing with adaptation where their benefits are not necessarily income generating. These are public goods. So how does that become attractive for the private sector, particularly adaptation? Also, tracking of adaptation finance in private sector is also quite challenging because most of it is voluntary and difficult to track. As well. So several things are there, and I know that you mentioned the issue around private sector in our countries as developing countries, and I think that's a good point where we now consider how we build or strengthen the private sector in our countries, such as your commercial banks, asset managers, the whole landscape or ecosystem of private sector that exists within our countries, and including how to then leverage private sector involvement in PPPs in particular, and public sector finance plays a very critical role in this sense to leverage PPPs in our countries, but particularly how we can work with those existing. And I think we've got various examples, and I'm not sure if these have been shared, of leveraging public financing, leveraging private sector participation in the issues of early warning systems, where you work with telecommunications. And I think we have these examples in many countries in Africa. So yeah, quite a lot of issues to consider, but certainly this is, we need to really understand why there's very little engagement with the private sector first. And I like the approach that you used, how deconstructing, starting from the deconstruction, how do we weaken it? And then how do we build it? So thank you.
Thank you so much. Really interesting conversation, and thanks for including the in-person participants on this board here online. There's a lot of interesting perspectives on there as well. A couple of thoughts on the private sector. So we're hearing a lot about how the private sector can help with adaptation, and that's certainly important, but I think it's also important to remember the private sector, individual businesses and industries are already adapting to climate change because it's good for their bottom lines. They are developing adaptation plans internal to their business models in order to make sure that their businesses and profits are not impacted by climate change. So I think it's a matter of
integrating those businesses and inviting them to share what they have learned through their own adaptation planning and policies with communities or governments that will benefit from that experience and knowledge. I think that they may not realize or may be hesitant to participate in those processes, but if governments can encourage or incentivize their businesses and industries to share what they're already learning. One way that we have seen this from the US perspective is that we've been working with islands in the Pacific and in the Caribbean to develop communities of practice around specific adaptation topics. One would be renewable energy systems in light of climate change, where we've included our governments and governments from the Caribbean and Pacific, but also the private electricity providers and transmission networks to meet together to talk about how they can learn from each other. Another one is sustainable tourism, and I'm glad the Maldives mentioned that, because many of the major like US hotel chains or European hotel chains have fairly extensive climate risk planning processes, particularly as it relates to tropical cyclones or hurricanes, and being able to share the data that they have gathered over time on climate, disaster risk reduction planning could be very beneficial to those communities. So I think it's a matter of just having that engagement in those communities of practice. And my final point is that the private sector holds a vast amount of data. And I know we're going to start talking about data, but because they have this incentive to plan long term, they also have an incentive to collect and analyze data. And the extent that which we can engage the private sector to share the data and analytics that they have, I think could very much benefit the countries that need more information to do better adaptation planning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And that will be synthesized later and summarized. I will not be trying to get into summarizing all this. So moving on to our second topic, which is the intergenerational equity. So this is a similar three-way discussion. We will be deconstructing and then constructing and then connecting. So the next question, as you can see here, how can we reverse, so how can we prevent a change in mindsets to the inclusion of intergenerational and gender equity and social justice considerations in designing framework and achieving the GGA? So how do we weaken it? How do we make sure gender equity and intergenerational equity is not included? So you've got 10 minutes. Start writing on the post-its. If you have the link, please also feel free to use that. And just a reminder, use the light blue when you use the light blue inner circle on the mirror. 3 minutes. So by now we know what we're doing. So if we can move to the second part, the reconstructing bit. I know some were very keen to go to the next section. They have a lot of solutions in mind. So I can see some people have jumped into the solution sections. Colleagues online and those participating in person, let's move to the solution question. So let's reverse it. What's the mind shift that we need, or what's the transformation we require? Because I think this packs a lot of broad categories, even though we call it intergenerational and gender equity. I think it's a bigger element to it. So let's move into the solution bit. We've got 7 minutes, and I know we'll take some time in the connecting the dots bit. So I'm sure everybody's done by now. So let's start kind of connecting the dots. And if you see this question, there are three elements. The first one is intergenerational equity, the second one being the gender equity, and the third one social justice. So in light of this, I would like to open the floor for your reflection on what needs to change and kind of connecting the dots. So floor is open. And for our online participants, if you can write your name so that we can see that you have your hands up.
Thank you very much. I think there are a lot of things, but just a few ideas or a few examples based on experience. One of the key elements, and I've seen it also in the notes itself, is the element of multilateral governance and multilateral systems. Whatever we identify as vulnerability in those different groups that I mentioned can only be identified by those people themselves. So if I have a top-down approach and have a NDC, an app, or an AMA that doesn't reflect any of those vulnerabilities that are happening on the ground, then it's not responsive. It doesn't include, it's not tailored to the ones that need to be included. When I understand vulnerability, I need to understand vulnerability not as a national problem. Vulnerability is a local problem. Vulnerability is the exposure, the sensitivity, the adaptive capacity. I can only identify that if I really go into communities, into local levels and ask and say, what are your vulnerabilities? And then do my vulnerability assessments. I can't have a climate profile understand for the entire nation. If I take, for example, Azerbaijan has 9 different climatic zones. Colombia has over 35 different climatic zones. How do I then define vulnerability if I look at the entire country? If I don't understand the vulnerability and the adaptation that's needed from a bottom-up approach.
around the multi-level nature. I mean, I think many countries. I can give an example of Botswana. We have a very established institutional arrangements around getting input from the local level, and I think many countries have that. And multi-level governance is certainly an important principle, particularly and in this context we're talking about a global framework, how we connect that to the global framework. So vulnerability, adaptive capacity, and resilience, all of that will have to go to the global framework. How does that inform that? So while as we do think about those bottom-up processes, we think about them in the context of a multi-level framework and how that vulnerability translates and how we understand vulnerability at the global level and what we actors at the global level have to do, because this is a global framework. And I just maybe built on that, also related to that, I think it's also important now. I'm seeing something like making principles such as locally led adaptation being part of the framework. I think and this is a point that has been made earlier, that there's a place, this is a multi-level governance process. So there's the international, national, some may have regional, but national certainly, because we already have a process that has been established, subnational, as going all the way to the communities. And this is where some of the issues that you raise around how do we get to understand vulnerabilities at the community level. I think let's not forget that some principles will be mostly applicable at different levels. Certainly these principles, and we need to unpack that a little bit more when we get into the elaboration of these points that were raised. Some will be relevant at the local level, some will be relevant at the national level, and not all of them will be relevant at the global level. So I think we need to make that quite clear, because and also understanding also our systems back in developing countries, that there is an elaborate system to ensure that development planning is done with the consideration of gender, consideration of local input, indigenous knowledge systems, and so on and so forth. I think we can't ignore that. I think it's important to acknowledge that process is happening at the local level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have anyone? And apologies, there was a little bit of a gap in audio, so I think that has been sorted now.
Thank you. I agree with the previous speakers in terms of really action now. I think that is important, especially if we want to address the gender equality, intergenerational equity, and also social justice issue. But building up on the bottom-up process as well, I agree with the initial speaker, the fact that we need to build really on the existing traditional knowledge and value systems of indigenous peoples and local communities. That is key. And of course, really existing as well. I think the biggest gap as well comes from issues of dedicated resources really for addressing gender equality. It's non-existent. It's usually missing in a lot of initiatives, and that's where the gap comes in. So it becomes a checkboxing. Gender issues addressed, tick participation of women, men, but no resources really to advance the work beyond the rhetoric. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone online?
I think I just want to build on the points that are shared by the two first speakers. I guess it's similar to what we were discussing in the first question around private sector, around establishing shared values. But mostly on this front, it's about ensuring that principles of protecting the fundamental liberties incorporated within the framing of the framework, the GGA framework, right? Because I guess this is cross-sectional in the sense that issues around indigenous knowledge and everything else are going to fall in place if we are covering it from those principles perspective. And the other one that I guess not many people have spoken about is the connection is on how do we leverage the different groups of informants or stakeholders for innovation within this space, within the framing of the GGA. I say this because we know that we are constantly, as negotiators, called out outside the space for not, consulting, for not having their views and so forth. So, from indigenous groups, from people that are, arguing, youths, young people, elders. So I guess in terms of intergenerational justice, intergenerational equity and social justice, embedding principles of how, or understanding on the onset that how can we leverage from one another or each other for innovation going forward is something that can help.
Thanks. I see, Jamie, you have commented on the chat. Everybody does not have access to that in person. So would you like to come in or?
Yeah, thank you very much. I welcome the opportunity to responding really to the idea and really trying to promote these principles which are sort of set out by the Global Commission on Adaptation. And one of the joys of them, and I've only put the headings in the chat there, but one of the joys of them is that they are actually applicable in the sense that it should be noted at every level. They're the principles for locally led adaptation in the sense of facilitating the most effective forms of adaptation. But the principles really talk to the international community. They talk to the donor community. They talk to nation states. They talk to all the people who have been talking in this workshop, and starting with this idea of devolving decision making to the lowest appropriate level. And I think, as my colleague in the plenary was suggesting, that changing mindsets really involves changing mindsets in terms of the parties to the UNFCCC, in a sense, because these are nation states, but they really must, I mean, in order to have effective adaptation, they must change the mindset of central control towards devolution. The second principle addresses those structural inequalities faced by women and youth and children that we've been talking about, and disabled, displaced people that we've been talking about in today's workshop. All have been talking about the capacity for developing countries and poor communities to adapt, and that involves patient and predictable funding and easy access to it. And that funding should invest in local capabilities that leave an institutional legacy, so that dependency on project-based funding and donors, etc., is broken. And we've, I mean, lots of speakers today and lots of the cars talk about understanding of risk and uncertainty. That needs to be built up, a robust understanding, and that's the fifth of the principles. There's only 3 more to go. This idea of flexible programming and learning, in project terms, that means adaptive management. That means being allowed to change what one says one is going to do with resources in order to cater for local conditions and changing conditions, and something which is very pertinent to adaptation. And overall, that is ensuring this transparency and accountability, but that would be downward accountability of funders to the local, rather than the other way up, which is the mindset that we're faced with at the moment. And finally, the call of the principles is for collaborative action and investment. Stop having this siloing between sort of a humanitarian, emergency, development, funding, but put all of these together. So I do hope that the notes of this workshop can really put the principles of locally led adaptation, this capital letters, because it's a published document, and can put those in front of the GGA so it can be considered and accepted as part of the framework. Thank you very much for your indulgence.
Thank you very much, Jamie. We only have 5 minutes, so I would like to give some new speakers, if there are any. And just to say, all of this will be captured in the summary note of the report. We will not. We have a report back session, but it's very unlikely that we'll be able to cover everything that has been said. It's more than what we've expected, and we're happy with the inputs that we have received, and we guarantee that this will be part of the bigger report that will come out, and not this might not include some of the points raised in the report back session letter. So. Anyone online who would like to take the last opportunity to speak, or anyone in person? So good news. We will finish here, and you have 10 minutes to enjoy coffee, and those online to take some break before we resume our last report back. Thank you very much.